Hello and welcome to the Starting Sisters series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the 9th edition Adepta Sororitas forces. In this video we'll be taking a look at the different holy orders that the Sisters of Battle have access to, and a lot has changed since the 8th edition codex to make a lot more of the holy orders a playable option within the new codex. As such, it's very exciting to see that there's a lot more variety and options available to sister players than there previously was, making Sisters a much more diverse army, not only because of the increased model range, but also because of the general balancing of various special rules, such as the Holy Orders. So what does a Holy Order have to offer? Well, every Holy Order offers a conviction, which gives different universal buffs to the units that belong to that Holy Order, a unique Warlord trait, a unique Relic, and a unique stratagem. To begin looking at the Holy Orders, we'll begin by looking at the Order of the Argent Shroud. The Order of the Argent Shroud was rated as one of the lowest orders, if not the lowest order within the 8th edition codex, being seen as a rather weak option. However, that being said, in 9th edition, it is probably one of the stronger options that is available to the Sisters, and as such, it's the biggest winner of the 9th edition codex in terms of different Holy Orders. The conviction for the Order of the Argent Shroud is called Deeds Not Words, and it's a rather powerful conviction, if not the strongest conviction that's available to your units. This conviction offers two different abilities. The first one being is that when a unit with this conviction moves or advances, it counts as remaining stationary during your shooting phase. This is an incredibly powerful benefit, as not only does it allow you to move with different units and suffer no penalty when shooting, it in addition allows you to advance and still fire weapons rather easily. And this means that the Order of the Argent Shroud is the fastest moving order of the Sisters' army, and mobility is a very important part of the 9th edition codex, and as such, it gives them so much more utility that other orders may have a hard time competing against this. Not only that, but the second half of the conviction isn't bad either, and the second part says, when a unit with this conviction shoots or fights, you can reroll one hit roll or one wound roll. And while this is a minor perk, at the end of the day, having the ability to reroll dice is never a bad thing to have, especially when you consider that it can be the difference between pushing through that wound or completely missing. More so because you avoid some of the penalties for moving and shooting, you actually need to reroll less because on average you'll be more accurate than other orders within the Sisters' army, meaning that this minor reroll benefit will actually go a lot further than you may expect at first glance. Following the conviction, which is incredibly good for the Argent Shroud, is the Warlord trait known as Selfless Heroism. Selfless Heroism is a Warlord trait that has two different abilities. The first ability is that the character bearing this trait is allowed to heroically intervene within 6 inches horizontally or 5 inches vertically. This is definitely a perfectly fine ability to have, and it gives you some ability to heroically intervene when you otherwise wouldn't be able to. That being said, it's not the most exciting trait, and the second part of the trait is much more interesting, saying that the bearer of this trait can fight first within combat. Being able to deal your damage before your opponent does is always a good thing to have, although even with the combination of these two abilities, I wouldn't say it's particularly the most interesting Warlord trait, as like many Warlord traits, it only benefits one unit and only benefits the unit in certain conditions. In many other cases, a Warlord trait will benefit more than just the character and will benefit multiple different units, allowing that Warlord trait to get far more mileage for your different units. As such, I would say Selfless Heroism isn't a bad trait to have, although it's not one that I'm particularly excited about. It's more of one that's reasonably okay. The relic for the Order of the Argent Shroud is called Quicksilver Veil. What this relic does is it adds 3 to the movement characteristic of the bearer of this relic, and enemies receive -1 to their hit roll when making attacks against the bearer of this relic. But at the end of the day, this relic only benefits one character and only has so much of an effect to the game as a whole. As such, you'll generally find better relics to choose from that have a bigger impact onto the game itself. Although that being said, there might be some situations where you can find some use for it. I still wouldn't rank it particularly highly compared to other relic options that you may have access to. And the last benefit that the Order of the Argent Shroud offers is their special stratagem, which is called Faith is Our Shield and costs 1 command point to activate. When you activate this stratagem, you select a target Argent Shroud unit, and models within that unit gain a 4+ feel no pain save against mortal wounds. This may not seem like much at first, but do remember mortal wounds are becoming more prevalent, and having an ability to prevent damage coming in from mortal wounds can be a rather powerful ability. And in many cases, on average, being able to negate 50% of the mortal wounds coming in from one of the many different abilities out there that is available can go quite a long way, as all of a sudden, some of the most powerful enemy output is negated by this stratagem. All in all, I would say that the Order of the Argent Shroud is mostly held up by its conviction and to some extent its stratagem. And while the Relic and the Warlord trait don't necessarily serve the biggest role when it comes to concerns about the power level of the Argent Shroud, they can definitely be playable and can be a bit of fun to use. Though that being said, what you're really looking at is to make the most of that conviction because of how powerful the mobility offered by the conviction is in comparison to many other options that you may have out there. And as such, the Order of the Argent Shroud is probably going to remain one of the strongest holy orders for the Sisters for a long time to come, simply because of how generically powerful that conviction is, and conviction being an ability that affects the most number of models in comparison to any of the other unique benefits that a holy order may offer to the Sisters of Battle units. In second place for the different holy orders within the forces of the Sisters of Battle is the Order of the Bloody Rose. And the Order of the Bloody Rose is probably the most nerfed order, going from 8th edition to 9th edition. This does not mean that the Order of the Bloody Rose is bad by any means, but rather it has gone from being the #1 order that was pretty much the only choice you had, or at the very least something you brought alongside a different order in every situation within the 8th edition codex, to an order that is still very powerful and very playable, as well as one that can still hold its own, but rather now it's an order within the same power level as many other orders. As such, it's still one of the top contenders for the best order within the Sisters of Battle, although it has seen a bit of a decrease in comparison to other orders who have, for the most part, seen an increase in power. To begin with the Order of the Bloody Rose, it's important to understand that the Order of the Bloody Rose is a melee-focused order, and the Sisters of Battle have a lot of really powerful melee options, making this order especially potent with some of their unit choices. As such, let's look at the conviction for the Order of the Bloody Rose, known as Quick to Anger. What Quick to Anger does is it focuses on the melee aspect of things, and it says if a unit charged, was charged, or heroically intervened, models in that unit first gain +1 attack to their attack characteristic, and in addition to that, they also gain +1 armor penetration to melee attacks for the duration of that fight phase. This means that melee units within the Order of the Bloody Rose not only make more attacks, but their attacks are also that much more deadlier, making them incredibly threatening and powerful when they perform that charge. In addition to that, because this ability also triggers when a unit is charged, and not only when it charges an enemy unit. This means that even range units that normally don't wish to engage enemy units can benefit from this rather heavily, as all of a sudden, when they are charged, they make more attacks, and their attacks have a little bit of armor penetration on it, and as such, even if they are destroyed, they will go down fighting and probably inflict some damage in return before being destroyed themselves. That being said, it also makes them much more resilient to swarm units that are just aiming to lock them down within melee combat, as all of a sudden, they can deal with swarms that much more easily, especially with that additional attack, meaning that it's much harder for your opponent to lock up your shooting units within melee combat. And as such, even though the order focuses on melee combat specifically, it does have its applications when it comes to shooting units within the army as well. Moving on to the Warlord trait for the Order of the Bloody Rose, the Warlord trait is called the Blazing Ire, and what the Blazing Ire does is it adds +1 attack to the attack characteristic of the bearer of this trait, as well as saying that the bearer of this trait can advance and still charge. This is actually a rather good ability, allowing the character bearing this trait to not only reach melee combat that much more easily, but also it increases their attack profile a little bit. This, coupled with some of the sacred rights, such as Hand of the Emperor, can really make it rather easy for a character to get into combat. And speaking of combat-oriented characters, the relic for the Order of the Bloody Rose is one that's called Beneficence. Beneficence is a giant chainsword, and it functions as an upgrade to a chainsword, meaning that the character that wishes to take this relic has to have a chainsword in order to replace. And what Beneficence does is it adds +2 strength to the melee attacks of the character and gives them 2 armor penetration, but only deals 1 damage. In addition to that, the character makes 3 additional attacks with this weapon. However, there's also a situation that if there are 6 or more enemy models within 3 inches of the character bearing Beneficence, that character gains an additional D3 attack, meaning that in total, if this condition is met, they'd be gaining D3 + 3 attacks in melee combat. In the past, there used to be a character build called the Becky, which was a canoness carrying the relic weapon Beneficence and most likely the Warlord trait known as Righteous Rage. And I still believe this type of build is very possible, although that being said, it's a little sad to see that Beneficence has lost one of its damage, going down to a damage characteristic of 1 from its previous 2 damage, though at the same time, it gained an additional point of strength and gained that rule about 6 models or more within a 3-inch range. As such, I still believe there's a place for the Becky build on a canoness, although at this time, the Becky will be much weaker dealing with things like Space Marines who have 2 wounds, but in exchange for that, she'll have a much easier time dealing with swarm armies, such as large blocks of Skitarii, Orc Warriors, or Necron Warriors. As a whole, that's not a bad place to be, although it's sad to see that she's been changed in this way, and at the very least she does not get worse against units that had damage reduction, as she'd be dealing 1 damage to them anyway, so the extra strength and potential extra attacks are a nice addition in that situation. Though what really probably hurts Becky as a whole is the addition of new characters, as well as revamping some of the older characters to make them more viable. This means that Becky has lost a little bit of her standing, and as such, she'll be a little less common going into the future. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a Becky on the playing field once again at some point once we start seeing some more of these swarm armies show up. And finally, the stratagem that the Order of the Bloody Rose offers is called Tear Them Down and costs 1 command point to activate. And what this does is, when a Bloody Rose model in a selected unit fights, it automatically wounds on an unmodified hit roll of 6. And while this isn't bad, you do need quite a large volume of attacks in order to make full advantage of this. In contrast, in the past, this stratagem would add +1 to the wound roll made by models within that unit. I think the older version of Tear Them Down was significantly better against the majority of the targets that the sisters would be fighting, considering that their melee attacks were generally rather strong. Though that being said, this new version of the stratagem does give the sisters some ability to put out some damage on rather big and frightening units when utilizing some of their more mid-range style of attacks within melee. At the end of the day, the Order of the Bloody Rose is still very powerful and has now become even more focused within melee than it was before, as it no longer benefits pistol weapons and the like. That being said, while the Order of the Bloody Rose has lost some power, I still think it's going to be one of the more popular ones, and so far based on the limited tournament results that we have seen, the Order of the Bloody Rose is still seeing quite a lot of play within the top tables of different competitive scenes, and will probably continue to do so for some time. And as a whole, this makes me rather happy, because all of a sudden you're seeing quite a good variety of different Sisters of Battle orders, as opposed to predominantly seeing the Order of the Bloody Rose. Though at the same time, the Order of the Bloody Rose hasn't been nerfed into the ground, and is still very viable, which is a win-win situation as a whole. In third place for the different sacred orders is the Order of the Valorous Heart, and the Valorous Heart is another one of those orders that did particularly well in the 8th edition codex, being one of the only orders able to contend with the Bloody Rose in terms of popularity. As such, it is no surprise that the Order of the Valorous Heart is still particularly good. The conviction of the Order of the Valorous Heart is the Stoic Endurance, and as you'll soon see, the Order of the Valorous Heart focuses on being rather tough to destroy as opposed to damage output like the Order of the Bloody Rose, or mobility like the Order of the Argent Shroud. Stoic Endurance offers 2 different parts, both of which benefit the resilience of the models with this order. The first part of this conviction gives all models with this conviction a 5+ feel no pain save against mortal wounds. And as we already mentioned with the Order of the Argent Shroud, being able to negate mortal wounds is becoming more and more important, and being able to do so across multiple different units is a rather good ability to have, and while it might not be the most important ability in the world, it's still rather beneficial, especially when you consider the second part of this conviction is even better. The second part of this conviction reduces the armor penetration characteristic of enemy fire by 1 point if that armor penetration characteristic is 1 or 2. This means that any kind of light fire will have a very hard time of taking out the Sisters of Battle, and there are quite a few different weapons that have that kind of armor penetration characteristic. And as such, units from the Valorous Heart will require significantly more firepower investment in order to destroy than normal. And this is a rather big benefit, especially when you combine this with the ability to negate mortal wounds, as oftentimes mortal wounds are the way of dealing damage to units with abilities such as this. Already we're off to a great start with a conviction that is very powerful, and this puts the Order of the Valorous Heart in a very good position to become the #1 order that the Sisters of Battle can choose from. The Warlord trait for the Order of the Valorous Heart continues down the theme of being very hard to destroy, being called impervious to pain. What impervious to pain does is it makes the bearer of this trait regain 1 wound when the bearer performs an act of faith. In addition to that, the bearer gains a flat 5+ feel no pain against everything and not just mortal wounds. This trait can be rather good, especially when combined with other means of reducing potential incoming damage, such as the Mantle of Saint Ophelia. And the combination of impervious to pain, along with the conviction, as well as other damage reduction options, can really make a character impossible to move off of an objective, or just simply annoying enough that most enemies will have to sink a lot of investment into that character before being able to deal with them. And as such, while I usually don't like abilities that only benefit one character instead of multiple different units, I think this one has some serious potential as an additional Warlord trait, thanks to the fact that it can get out of hand rather quickly when combined with different relics, as well as the base conviction. And as such, even though it affects one character, I think you'll see this trait somewhat commonly in many different lists that want to make a character be able to survive most attacks that it takes. As for the relic of the Valorous Heart, it's called Casket of Penance, and it breaks away from the trend that we've seen so far. However, it does make enemies less resilient to your attacks, so at least it ties into the theme of the order in that situation. What the Casket of Penance does is enemies within 3 inches of the bearer of the casket gain -1 toughness, and if those units are chaos units, they gain -1 strength as well. This is actually a rather decently powerful relic and can definitely have its applications within certain situations. That being said, the range is somewhat limited, and the Sisters of Battle have quite a lot of different relics to choose from, although this one is a rather interesting one and can contend with some of those other relics as well, although I think it's just underneath the power level of what we may see with some of those other relics. The stratagem for the Order of the Valorous Heart is called Blind Faith, and for 1 command point, it allows you to select a unit, and that unit ignores ballistic skill and weapon skill modifiers for the duration of a fight or shoot phase. This is definitely an interesting stratagem, although I don't know how particularly good or how applicable it will be in a lot of cases. There will definitely be situations where this does make a difference, and the fact that you have access to it by going into an order that's rather powerful thanks to its conviction and things like the Relic and Warlord trait, this definitely is a fine niche choice that can be rather useful and nice to have access to in situations where you really need it. Though that being said, I wouldn't necessarily go into this order specifically for this stratagem, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, as once again, the conviction and other things give you enough to work with that having a little bit of a niche ability is perfectly acceptable. Overall, the Order of the Valorous Heart has a very interesting playstyle for those who enjoy tankier units and can offer the Sisters of Battle some extra resilience in order to stay alive and continue holding objectives in ways that your opponent may not expect or see coming. As mentioned, it's definitely one of those orders that can be very prevalent and can continue seeing play for quite a long time, especially when considering new units such as the Sacrosancts and other options that are already rather resilient and can become all the more resilient with the abilities that the Conviction of the Valorous Heart offers to your units. In 4th place, we have the Order of the Ebon Chalice, and the Order of the Ebon Chalice is another order that has seen a significant improvement and is finally seeing play where it has not seen much play within the 8th edition rule set. The Order of the Ebon Chalice focuses on flamer-style weapons, although it has many other benefits outside of that realm of usage. The conviction of the Order of the Ebon Chalice is called Daughters of the Emperor. The first part of this order allows you to select 2 sacred rites instead of 1 and gain the benefit of both of those sacred rites. This can allow you to build an alternate melee version or gain access to some more utility through sacred rites, though at the end of the day, if you really want to go into melee build, the Order of the Bloody Rose is probably a better option overall. Though that being said, gaining access to 2 sacred rites as an additional benefit is a rather good one to have and can definitely help you with versatility because of the way you select sacred rites when playing a game. The second part of this conviction says that when performing an act of faith, you can discard a miracle dice to make the miracle dice being used count as a 6. Essentially, the best way to think about this is to think about it as combining 2 dice to form one result that is much more consistent. So you have to ask yourself, how often did you have 2 3s or something like a 2 and a 3 that you wish to combine into a 6 or a 5 while playing Sisters of Battle and you just couldn't, so you ended up with a bunch of mediocre rolls within your miracle dice pool that you were having a hard time to use. If you find yourself in that situation quite often, this is definitely a great conviction to have in your situation. That being said, miracle dice are a rather important commodity, and using them up too quickly can easily leave you without any miracle dice to use for morale tests or other such situations where you would really like to have them. And as such, at the end of the day, this ability definitely requires a lot of skill to use properly so that you're not wasting unneeded miracle dice in situations where you can save them for other uses. The Warlord trait of the Ebon Chalice is actually an interesting Warlord trait known as Terrible Knowledge. This Warlord trait has 2 different parts to it, the first one being that the miracle dice you gain in your first battle round is always a 6, no matter what happens if the Warlord is on the battlefield when this occurs. This isn't anything spectacular, but it's definitely nice to begin the game with a miracle dice of 6 as opposed to any other result. Though in some cases you would have rolled a 6 anyway, and this part of the ability would have been useless. Though 5 times out of 6, this ability will have given you a little bit of an extra perk. The second part of this Warlord trait is that when you use a stratagem, you roll a d6, and on a 5+, you regain a command point if the Warlord is on the battlefield. The nice thing about this is if you're using a lot of stratagems, this can definitely help replenish your command points and keep you at a healthy amount of command points, as it's rather easy to sometimes run out of command points, especially early on in the game when you have a lot of different things to do with those different command points. As for the relic of the Ebon Chalice, it's one that I don't really know how to feel about. This relic is called Annunciation of the Creed, and it upgrades a Condemner bolt gun on a model into this new weapon known as Annunciation of the Creed. The Annunciation of the Creed has two different range profiles, sort of like a combat weapon, and continuing the theme of the combat weapon, you can select one or both of the profiles, but if you do end up selecting both, you gain -1 to hit when shooting at the target. In addition to this weapon ignores Lookout Sir abilities when targeting units. Now let's look at the two different profiles that this weapon has to offer. The first profile has a 24-inch range with a rapid fire of 1 and 4 strength with 1 damage. This is your rather standard bolter profile and nothing special. Where it becomes more interesting is the Blessed Stake profile. The Blessed Stake has a 24-inch range with an Assault 1 profile, 4 strength, 2 armor penetration, and 2 damage. But what really makes it interesting is when an attack is allocated to a Psyker model, the unit that the Psyker is in suffers 3 mortal wounds in addition to any normal damage. And keep in mind that you can ignore Lookout Sirs, so it's much easier to target Psyker characters than it normally would be. And as all, this is why I have such a hard time deciding how I feel about this weapon, as all of a sudden you can put out quite a few mortal wounds with some rather reasonable consistency against Psyker heavy armies. And having a 24-inch range with an assault profile and being able to target characters is an incredibly good mix of different abilities, considering how many mortal wounds this can generate. Normally, I'm really hesitant when it comes to relic weapons, but I think the sisters have some of the best weapon options when it comes to different relics, as they can put out so much damage that they make up for giving up some of the relics that can buff multiple models within a unit. Though that being said, you do have to consider that some armies don't necessarily have Psykers, so this will be incredibly weak against those armies. This means you have to have a very good understanding of your meta, and you have to make sure that what you're giving up to take this weapon is a reasonable sacrifice to make. If you fight no armies with Psykers, you've essentially reduced your chance of winning significantly by taking this weapon. Though on the other hand, if you fight predominantly Psyker heavy armies, this weapon can generate an incredible amount of mortal wounds throughout the game and destroy priority targets rather effectively. Now looking at the stratagem for the Ebon Chalice, it's definitely a stratagem that makes the Ebon Chalice stand out in comparison to other orders within the Sisters of Battle. This stratagem is known as Cleansing Flame and costs 1 command point to use. When you use the stratagem, you select a unit and that unit gains +4 inches of range to its flame or weapons, and in addition to that, each unmodified wound roll of 4+ with a flamer deals 1 additional mortal wound in addition to any other damage to a maximum of 3 mortal wounds dealt by the stratagem. This stratagem essentially will deal 3 mortal wounds in most situations, and being able to generate mortal wounds is rather powerful. Though once again, this kind of reinforces as to why being able to have a save against mortal wounds, such as Valorous Heart or Argent Shroud, is never a bad thing to have. To think about this ability in a certain light, to understand how consistent it is, a unit with Seraphims, with one of the Seraphims having 2 hand flamers, will on average generate 3 mortal wounds using this ability, but to be on the safe side, you can have 2 Seraphims, both armed with 2 hand flamers, making you pretty much always gain the full 3 mortal wounds from this ability. In addition to that, Retributors with heavy flamers may have some new life thanks to this ability, and while the stratagem alone wouldn't be enough to push you into Ebon Chalice by itself, it would definitely make taking a small detachment of Ebon Chalice with those hand flamer Seraphims a reasonable tactic. However, when looking at the Ebon Chalice, you have access to a rather reasonable conviction, a rather reasonable warlord trait, and a situationally powerful relic that can do quite a lot of damage. As such, the Ebon Chalice has a lot of different parts that individually aren't particularly the strongest, but in combination can do quite a bit of work for your forces. And I think as such, Ebon Chalice will be an order that shows up relatively regularly. Even though it might not be the best order, it will at the very least be an order you can select as an additional detachment to go along with your primary detachment in order to gain access to some of these different abilities, such as an extra Sacred Rite on that detachment or access to the Cleansing Flames stratagem, as well as sometimes the Relic or the Warlord trait if you so desire. And last on our list for the different orders of the Sisters of Battle is the Order of the Sacred Rose. The Order of the Sacred Rose was an order that was considered to be a rather weak one in the previous 8th edition codex, and it seems to have retained that position even though it's seen some improvements, and luckily it might find a home someday, even if at the moment it's considered the weakest order out of the different ones you can choose. That being said, let's take a look at what the Order of the Sacred Rose has to offer. The conviction benefits of the Order of the Sacred Rose are called Devout Serenity, and Devout Serenity begins off with a rather weak ability that says units with this order automatically pass their combat attrition tests. Once again, I'm never a big fan of combat attrition tests, as they don't have that much of an impact on the game itself, and the Sisters of Battle already have so many different ways of interacting with the combat attrition test, whether that's through sacred rites, battle hymns, or even their miracle dice, that going into an order specifically for this ability seems like a rather weak option. If anything, this conviction should have had 3 different abilities, with this being the 3rd ability that gives you a little extra mileage, but does not actually really matter in the grand scheme of things. The second benefit of this conviction is much more interesting, and it says each time use a miracle dice for an act of faith with a model of this conviction, roll a d6 and gain a miracle dice on a roll of 4+. In other words, half the time this will refund one of your miracle dice when you use them. This can be rather powerful, and this is actually a good reason to go into this order if you enjoy playing with your miracle dice, because miracle dice have become a little harder to obtain within the 9th edition codex, and in addition to that, there are secondary objectives that benefit from you being able to use quite a few different miracle dice. This means that with those 2 things in mind, this order might actually see some play, because this part of the conviction is actually rather powerful and reasonably enough consistent to draw players into this order specifically. Following their conviction is the Warlord trait, known as Light of the Divine. And what Light of the Divine says is that once per turn, when the bearer of this trait performs an act of faith, one miracle dice they use is considered to be automatically a 6, regardless of what it actually is. This is a great way to use up miracle dice, especially if you find that you're performing quite a lot of acts of faith with your Warlord or another character that can carry this Warlord trait. In addition to that, this trait gives one other ability, which is the Light of the Divine Aura, and it says that Sacred Rose core units within 6 inches of the bearer can fall back and still shoot within the same turn. This is also a rather powerful ability, although it's rather limited in terms of the range that it has, meaning that you have to be very careful when positioning the character with this ability so that you can gain full benefit of this aura, as sometimes you might find that the unit you want to fall back and shoot with is out of range of this aura. In either case, the combination of these 2 abilities does make this Warlord trait rather powerful and rather interesting when you can make full use of that aura. The Relic, on the other hand, is a little less impressive, that being the Light of Saint Agneth. And the Light of Saint Agneth upgrades the Brazier of Holy Fire to the Light, which has a 12-inch range, d6 assault shots, and no other stat profile except for the fact that on a 4+2 wound, this deals 1 mortal wound, and this ability upgrades against demon units to deal mortal wound on a 2+. On average, you would at most be scoring 1 to 2 mortal wounds, depending on the ballistic skill of the bearer of this model. Overall, this ends up being a rather mediocre relic. I wish I had more opportunities to inflict mortal wounds, or simply had a bit of a longer range. At the very least, they could have made it a standalone item as opposed to an upgrade to the Brazier of Holy Flame, as it really limits its usage considering you have to give up an item and points in order to utilize this. Though at the end of the day, I don't think it's the worst item, I just think it's a little bit mediocre considering you first have to hit and then you have to try to wound in order to generate those mortal wounds. And then the stratagem for the Order of the Sacred Rose is the Emperor's Judgment. The Emperor's Judgment costs 1 command point, and it says the range attacks made by a selected unit for the duration of the phase score an additional hit on an unmodified roll of 6 to hit. This is definitely not a bad ability to have, especially if you have a unit that can benefit from this, that's making a lot of shots with specialized weapons. Though once again, remember for every 6 shots you make, you're on average going to score 1 additional hit, making it a little harder to use. And for the most part, you do have other ways of gaining similar abilities on bolt weapons, such as the Hymn of Battle, making this a little more redundant, although it's never bad to have a backup or an additional ability that can do something similar. Though if you do end up using it with something like the Retributors armed with multi-meltas and get a lucky roll, you can be doing quite a ton of damage to a specific target. And to conclude the Order of the Sacred Rose, I'll say overall that it's not necessarily a bad order, it's just a little less apparently powerful than some of the other order options that we've covered in this video. I think overall, all of the different Sisters of Battle orders are currently playable, and that's a very impressive thing in terms of game balance. It'll be interesting to see how the different orders turn out as time progresses, and different ones rise to the top while other ones sink to the bottom. In addition to that, if you're an attentive viewer, you'll see that we skipped over the Order of Our Martyred Lady. And the reason for this is that I think the Order of Our Martyred Lady deserves its own video, as it's an order that has not only the base order benefits, but also a special character in the form of Argent Shroud, and has recently gained quite a few additional rules thanks to the Book of Fire, which is the second Warzone Caradon supplement to be released, and has added quite a lot to that order, making it an order we should take the time to observe on its own. So join me next time when we'll be looking at the Order of the Martyred Lady and everything that order has to offer us. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel, as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.